The Xenolinguistic Archive Station floated in the endless darkness of space like a lonely sentinel watching over a tomb. Below it, the planet known as Predecessor 7 spun silently, its surface barren and lifeless. Once, this world had been home to a great civilization. Once, it had bustled with life and activity, but that was thousands of years ago. Now, only ruins remained, scattered across the dead rocks and dust. Dr. Kefforn stood at the observation window of the archive station, staring down at the planet below. His crystalline body caught the light of a distant star, throwing rainbow patterns across the metal walls around him. As a Zoltian, Kefforn possessed a form of intelligence that most other species could hardly comprehend. His brain was not soft and wet like the humans or the Valstronians. Instead, it was made of pure crystalline structure, capable of processing information at speeds that would make any computer jealous. For 300 years, the Collective had sent their finest minds to this station. The Collective was an alliance of 7 different spacefaring species who had banded together for trade, science, and protection. They had pooled their knowledge and resources to solve one of the greatest mysteries in the known galaxy. The mystery was simple but frustrating. There was a language written on the monuments of the dead planet below. No one could read it. The inscriptions covered the largest structures on Predecessor 7. They were massive, some stretching hundreds of meters across the stone faces. Scientists had studied these writings for 3 centuries. Linguists had examined every symbol. Artificial intelligence systems had run trillions of analyses. Yet the language remained locked away, its secrets hidden behind an impenetrable wall of mystery. Kefforn turned away from the window and walked through the corridors of the archive station. The corridors were long and empty now. The research team had dwindled over the years. When the Collective had first discovered the Predecessor ruins, they had sent hundreds of researchers. Now, only a handful remained. The budget had been cut repeatedly. Politicians across the Collective had argued that the project was a waste of resources. The language was not yielding to traditional analysis. Perhaps, they said, it was simply too alien to understand. The main research chamber was quiet when Kefforn entered. A few junior researchers looked up from their workstations, then quickly returned to their tasks. They all knew that they were working on a project that the larger Collective had largely abandoned. Success had become almost impossible to imagine. Failure was the only realistic expectation. Kefforn moved to the central analysis terminal, where images of the Predecessor inscriptions floated in holographic display. The symbols were beautiful in their complexity. There were curved lines and sharp angles. Some characters seemed simple, while others were intricate and elaborate. But beauty was useless without meaning. Without the ability to read them, these symbols were just pretty patterns. "Any progress?" Kefforn asked, though he already knew the answer. A Valstronid named Helix turned in her seat. Her blue-green skin rippled as she sighed. The quantum linguistic matrix found 17 possible interpretations of the Northern Monument's 3rd section. All of them contradict the Southern Monument's inscriptions. The AI suggests that either the language was constantly evolving, or the monuments were written thousands of years apart by different civilizations. Or, Kefforn said quietly, we are still asking the wrong questions. He had been saying this for years. His colleagues had stopped listening. They believed in the power of data and analysis. They believed that if you threw enough computing power and intellectual horsepower at a problem, it would eventually crack. Kefforn was beginning to doubt this. He spent the rest of the day reviewing old research files. He read theories written by some of the greatest linguistic minds in the galaxy. He studied the work of artificial intelligences that processed information in ways that biological minds could never match. All of it was thorough. All of it was intelligent. And all of it had failed to unlock the meaning of the Predecessor language. As night fell over the station, though up here in space, night was merely a convention, not a natural occurrence, Kefforn retired to his quarters. His living space was sparse and clean, decorated only with a few crystalline structures that reminded him of his homeworld. He downloaded the day's research into his neural matrix and let his consciousness sink into contemplation. He dreamed of symbols and meanings, of dead civilizations and lost words. In his dreams, he could almost hear the predecessors speaking. Almost, but not quite. The next morning brought unusual news. A message came through the collective's communications network. The news spread through the archive station quickly, creating a buzz of excitement that had not been felt in years. Humanity had finally joined the collective. The first group of human representatives was being assigned to various projects across all the Allied space stations. One of them was coming here. Kethvorn felt a small spark of curiosity. Humanity had only recently achieved space travel. They were by far the youngest species in the collective. They had no advanced artificial intelligence of their own. Their biological limitations were significant, yet they had somehow managed to impress the other species enough to earn a seat at the table. Perhaps, Kethvorn thought, a fresh perspective might be useful. He did not know then how right he would be. He did not know that this human's arrival would change everything. He did not know that the impossible solution to a 300-year-old mystery was about to walk through the doors of the archive station wearing the uniform of a military officer. The morning light of the distant star illuminated the archive station, and below, the dead planet kept its secrets, waiting for someone to finally know how to listen. Captain James Hendricks stepped out of the transport shuttle and into the hangar bay of the Xenolinguistic Archive Station. He was a tall man with weathered skin and gray streaking through his dark hair. His face bore the lines of someone who had spent many years under harsh suns and in difficult places. His eyes were sharp, always scanning, always watching. These were the eyes of a soldier who had learned that survival often depended on noticing small details. A young coordinator named Tessix waited for him. Tessix was a krell, a species that resembled walking insects in many ways. His exoskeleton clicked softly as he extended a limb toward Hendricks in greeting. Hendricks shook it firmly. He had learned to work with alien species during his military career, and he knew that showing respect for their customs was important. "Captain Hendricks, welcome to the archive station," Tessix said, his translator converting the clicks of his native language into clear English. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" "Survived it," Hendricks replied simply. He was not a man of many words, especially not when dealing with formalities and greetings. "Excellent. I have been assigned to help you during your stay. I understand you are a military officer with extensive field experience. That is good. We can use different perspectives here." Tessix pulled up a holographic display on a portable device. "Dr. Kethvorn, our lead researcher, is currently in the main analysis chamber. However, I should brief you first on what we are doing here." They walked through the corridors of the station. Hendricks noted the architecture, the security measures, the placement of emergency exits. Old habits died hard. Years of military training had taught him to always know his surroundings. Tessix explained the project in simple terms. 300 years ago, we discovered a dead planet with ancient monuments. These monuments have writings in a language that no one has ever been able to read. The collective has dedicated tremendous resources to understanding this language, but so far, we have failed. "Why does it matter?" Hendricks asked. "If the civilization is dead, what difference does it make if we read their language?" Tessix's exoskeleton rippled in what might have been a gesture of surprise. "We do not know what it matters. That is why we want to read it. Perhaps it contains important scientific knowledge. Perhaps it holds the story of what happened to them. Or perhaps it is simply the natural desire of all intelligent species to understand those who came before us." Hendricks nodded. That made sense. He understood the desire to understand. In his military career, understanding the enemy had often been the difference between victory and defeat. They arrived at the main analysis chamber, where Kethvorn was waiting. The Zaltian scientist was impressive to look at, with his crystalline structure refracting light into colors that seemed almost alive. But Hendricks had learned not to judge intelligence or capability by appearance. He had fought alongside beings that looked terrifying, and faced enemies that looked peaceful. Appearance meant nothing. "Captain Hendricks," Kethvorn said, his voice like wind chimes. "Welcome to our station. I am Dr. Kethvorn, lead researcher of this project. You have an unusual background for an assignment to a scientific facility." "I'm here to learn," Hendricks said honestly. "The collective thought it would be good for humanity to have exposure to different types of work. My commanders thought I was the right person for it." "We shall see," Kethvorn replied. "Come, let me show you what we do here." For the next hour, Kethvorn walked Hendricks through the research facility. He showed him the holographic displays of the predecessor inscriptions. He explained the various theories about the language. He introduced him to other researchers, all of them from different species, all of them intelligent and dedicated. They showed him the analysis they had done, the patterns they had found, the dead ends they had reached. Hendricks listened quietly and carefully. He simply observed. Finally, Kethvorn asked, "What do you think, Captain? What is your first impression?" Hendricks walked up to one of the holographic displays. He stood there for a long moment, studying the symbols. They were arranged on what looked like a monument wall. The symbols repeated in places. Some were grouped together. Others seemed isolated. "Can I ask a dumb question?" Hendricks said finally. Kethvorn's crystalline structure dimmed slightly. This was, Hendricks would later learn, the Zaltian equivalent of showing frustration or weariness. But Kethvorn answered politely, "Of course, Captain. All questions have value." Why does everyone assume that this was written to be understood by people reading it centuries later? The research chamber fell silent. Every head turned, every eye fixed on the human who had just asked something that no one had thought to ask. Kethvorn's crystals brightened slightly. "Explain what you mean, Captain." "Well," Hendricks said, pointing at the symbols, "look at this. It repeats a lot. These scholars, they probably thought that meant something about the grammar or the structure of the language, right? But what if it just means the writer was trying to really get someone's attention? What if they kept saying the same thing over and over because they needed people to remember it?" Kethvorn moved closer to the display. For the first time in 300 years, someone was asking a question that approached the mystery from a completely different direction. "Captain," Kethvorn said slowly, "where did you get that idea?" "In the military," Hendricks said simply, "you learn that people who are desperate don't write fancy. They don't think about grammar. They just want someone to understand the message before it's too late." The crystalline being stood motionless for a long moment. Then he turned to the researchers gathered in the chamber. "Clear the display," he commanded. "Clear all previous analysis. We are starting again." For the first time in 300 years, the predecessor language was about to begin giving up its secrets. And it had taken a human soldier, not a brilliant scientist, to ask the right first question. Over the following weeks, Captain Hendricks became a regular presence in the research chamber. He did not pretend to be a linguist. He did not claim to understand advanced theoretical concepts. Instead, he brought something that the archive station had been missing for 300 years. He brought the perspective of someone who had lived through chaos, desperation, and survival. He began studying the inscriptions from a completely different angle. Where the scholars had looked for grammatical patterns and linguistic structures, Hendricks looked for something else. He looked for the way messages were organized. He looked for what was repeated and what was rare. He looked for emphasis and urgency. Working late into the station's artificial night cycle, Hendricks filled entire walls with his own notes and observations. He drew pictures of military formations. He sketched out supply line diagrams. He created maps showing how soldiers typically organized messages about evacuation routes and safe locations. Kethvorn watched this work with fascination. the crystalline scientist would sit silently for hours, observing Hendrix think and work. The Zoltian had never witnessed this kind of analysis before. It was not logical in the traditional sense. It was intuitive. It was based on understanding how the human mind worked under extreme pressure. "Captain," Kethvon asked one night, "how do you know that the predecessors would organize their messages the same way that your military does?" Hendrix looked up from his notes. "I don't," he said honestly. "But intelligent beings under pressure all think in similar ways. You protect your supplies. You mark your escape routes. You gather your people. You leave messages for those who come after you. These are not human things. They are survival things." One evening, a breakthrough came. Hendrix was comparing 3 different monument sections that the research team had been studying separately for years. He noticed something strange. The spacing and arrangement of symbols seemed to follow a pattern that reminded him of something he had seen before. "These look like casualty reports," he said to Kethvorn, who was working nearby. "Casualty reports?" Kethvorn asked. "Yeah. In military battles, when units take heavy losses, the commanders organize their reports in specific ways. This section here, with the repeated symbols and the way they're grouped, it matches the pattern of how we list the dead." Hendrix pulled up images of ancient human military documents on the analysis terminal. He had brought files of historical military records with him to the station. He placed these files next to the holographic images of the predecessor inscriptions. The similarity was undeniable. "If I am understanding correctly," Kethvorn said slowly, "you are suggesting that the predecessors were not leaving behind a scientific archive or a historical record. They were leaving behind a record of a disaster. They were documenting what was happening to them as it happened." "More than that," Hendrix said, "they were doing it fast. No fancy writing, no careful organization for future scholars. They were just throwing information onto stone because they needed someone to know what happened to them." Word of Hendrix's theories spread through the research team. Some of the younger researchers embraced it immediately. Others were skeptical. How could a military officer with no linguistic training possibly understand something that 300 years of brilliant scientists had missed? But the evidence was becoming hard to ignore. Kethvorn made the decision to reorganize the entire research approach. Every inscription would now be studied not as a piece of ancient literature to be decoded by scholars, but as a wartime document to be understood by someone who had lived through emergency situations. The research team worked intensely. Hendrix helped them see patterns they had missed. A section that the AI systems had identified as possibly mathematical was actually a personnel roster. A series of symbols that seemed grammatically unusual was actually a hastily written set of instructions for survivors. A long inscription that had frustrated analysts for decades was a record of the names of those who had been lost. "They were documenting their extinction," Hendrix said one night, staring at the holographic images floating in the darkness of the research chamber. "They knew it was coming. They tried to warn whoever came after." Kethvorn's crystalline body hummed softly. It was a sound the Zoltian made when processing difficult information. "You understand them, Captain. You understand not the language, but the spirit of the language. That is far more valuable." "I understand desperate people," Hendrix corrected. "I've been desperate. I've seen others desperate. Desperate people all think the same way, no matter what species they are." The breakthrough began to accelerate. With each correct interpretation, the research team unlocked more of the language. The patterns became clearer. The meaning began to emerge from the ancient stone. But there was something else in the inscriptions. Something that made even the hardened soldier go pale when he finally understood it. There were warnings. The predecessors had not just been documenting their death. They had been trying to explain what caused it. They had been trying to describe something that had hunted them. Something that had destroyed their civilization, methodically and completely. And there were instructions. Detailed instructions on how to recognize this threat, how to avoid it, how to survive if you encountered it. "Captain," Kethorn said quietly, "do you understand what this means?" Hendricks stood at the holographic display, reading the decoded text that had been locked away for 3,000 years. He thought about the predecessors, a great civilization that had tried to pass a warning to anyone intelligent enough to eventually read it. "It means," Hendricks said slowly, "that the collective has been looking at this all wrong. This isn't an ancient library. This is a message from people who died, trying to tell us something. And now, after 300 years, we can finally hear what they wanted to say." The fate of the entire collective was about to change, because one human soldier had asked a simple question. A question that no one else had thought to ask. The translation of the predecessor language accelerated dramatically over the next 3 months. Working together, the research team and Captain Hendricks made progress that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. They had discovered something revolutionary. The predecessors had left behind not riddles or mysteries, but a direct account of their final days. One night, while working alone in the research chamber during the late hours of the station's artificial night cycle, Hendricks was studying a particularly detailed section of one of the larger monuments. He had been cross-referencing military casualty patterns with the predecessor inscriptions, a technique that had become his specialty. His hands froze on the keyboard. One sequence of symbols had translated clearly, not in fragments or uncertain interpretations, but in clear, unambiguous language. Hendricks read it 3 times to make sure he was understanding correctly. "To whoever finds this, we survived, we scattered, look for the signal fires." He called Kethorn immediately. The crystalline scientist arrived within minutes, still processing what Hendricks had found. The two of them stared at the holographic translation floating in the darkness of the chamber. "They survived," Kethorn whispered. "The predecessors did not all die in the catastrophe. Some of them escaped." "That changes everything," Hendricks said. "If some survived, they would have left records somewhere. They would have left markers. They would have built shelters." Hendricks pulled up the archaeological survey maps that had been taken of the dead planet. The surveys had identified thousands of structures, but most had been assumed to be ancient ruins with no significant value. Now, with their new understanding of how the predecessors thought, everything looked different. "Here," Hendricks said, pointing to several locations on the map. "Look at these sites. They form a pattern, not random, but deliberate. They're positioned to see each other. Signal fires. That's what they meant." The information was brought to the collective's high command. For the first time, the archive station received a sudden influx of resources. Advanced scanning equipment was brought online. Archaeologists from every species in the collective converged on Predecessor 7. The discoveries came in rapid succession. They found underground bunkers, hidden beneath layers of ancient rock. They found sealed chambers containing records carved into stone. They found evidence of organized communities that had survived the initial catastrophe and tried to rebuild in secret. They found the remains of beacon systems that had tried to signal other survivors across continents. But most importantly, they found something that changed everything. Deep within one of the largest underground structures, the archaeologists discovered a control chamber. At the center of this chamber was a device of extraordinary complexity. The research team worked for weeks to understand its purpose. When they finally activated it, with careful precautions, and Hendricks watching over their shoulders, the entire chamber came to life. Holographic systems flickered on. Ancient recordings began to play. The predecessors had created a message. Not just written words on stone, but actual recordings. Actual voices of the people who had lived 3,000 years ago. For the first time, the collective heard the predecessors speak. The recording was fragmented and damaged, but the message was clear. The predecessors were describing something. They called it the Devourer. They described it as something that came from beyond their world, something intelligent, something that hunted methodically, and completely. The predecessors had tried to fight. They had tried to understand it. In the end, they had been forced to scatter and hide. But before they hid, they had spent years studying their enemy. They had learned its patterns. They had learned how it hunted. They had learned how to avoid it. And they had left instructions. Hendrix spent weeks helping translate the detailed descriptions the predecessors had left behind. The descriptions were careful and precise, written by a people who understood that their survival depended on accuracy. They documented how the devourer moved, how it sensed prey, how it communicated with others of its kind, how to remain hidden from it. There was also a warning. The predecessors believed that the devourer was still active. It was out there, somewhere in the vast darkness of space. It hunted slowly, searching methodically through the galaxy. The predecessors urged whoever found their messages to be careful, to prepare, to be ready. The collective fell into shocked silence. For 300 years, they had thought they were alone in a galaxy that held only themselves and the abandoned ruins of dead civilizations. Now they understood. They were not alone. They were being hunted by something that had already destroyed at least one advanced civilization. An emergency session of the Collective Council was called. Hendrix was invited to attend, a tremendous honor for a military officer from a species that had only recently joined their alliance. He stood in the great chamber, surrounded by representatives from 7 different species, and presented what he had learned. The predecessors were not careless, Hendrix said simply. They were systematic. They studied their enemy. They documented everything. They left us a survival guide written in blood and desperation. We need to read it like it was written, not as ancient history, but as an active threat assessment. The council members looked at each other. For the first time, they realized something that would reshape their entire civilization. The youngest member of their alliance, the human who had asked a simple question weeks ago, had given them the most valuable gift imaginable. He had given them warning. He had given them a chance. Captain Hendrix, the council leader said formally, humanity has served the collective well. Prepare yourself. You will have resources beyond anything you have asked for. We must understand this threat completely, and we must be ready when it comes. The ceremony that followed was extraordinary. Hendrix was formally recognized as a scholar and advisor to the collective. His military rank was honored, but his new role was far more significant. He was now one of the most important people in the Alliance. But as he stood in the halls of the archive station later, watching the predecessor inscriptions glow in their holographic displays, Hendrix felt only the weight of responsibility. Somewhere out in the darkness of space, an ancient enemy still hunted. And it was coming. It was always coming. 2 years had passed since Captain James Hendrix first asked his simple question. The archive station had been transformed. It was no longer a lonely outpost with a dwindling budget and a failing project. It was now the most important scientific and strategic facility in the known galaxy. The main chamber of the Collective Council was vast and magnificent. Representatives from 7 different species stood in a circle, awaiting the presentation that would determine the future of their alliance. Captain Hendrix stood at the center, holding a data tablet that contained the sum of all knowledge the collective had gained from the predecessor language. Hendrix was not wearing military dress uniform anymore. Instead, he wore formal clothing that represented his new status as a scholar and advisor. But his bearing was still that of a soldier. He stood straight, he made eye contact, he spoke with the confidence of someone who had stood on many battlefields and had always found a way to survive. "Thank you for allowing me to present my findings," Hendrix began. His voice was calm and clear. 2 years ago, I was brought to the archive station by the collective. I was not the most qualified person for the job. I had no advanced degrees. I had no expertise in linguistics or ancient languages. But I had something else. I had experience with desperate people. He paused, letting his words settle into the minds of his audience. The predecessors left behind a dead language. For 300 years, the brightest minds in the collective tried to understand it by treating it like an academic puzzle. They looked for complex patterns, they searched for hidden meanings, they analyzed and theorized, and they failed. Do you know why they failed? A Valstronid representative spoke up. Because the language was too alien? Because it was beyond our understanding? No, Hendricks said. They failed because they were asking the wrong question. They kept asking, what does this language structure tell us about the predecessors? But the real question was much simpler. The real question was, why would desperate people write this message? Keththorn, who stood to the side of the chamber, made a soft humming sound. This was his gesture of agreement and approval. Hendricks continued. When people are desperate, when they know they are about to die, when they need someone to understand their message before it is too late, they do not worry about grammar. They do not create beautiful poetry. They do not write for textbooks. They write for survivors. They write the things they wish someone had told them. He activated the holographic display. Images of the predecessor inscriptions began to float in the air, along with their translations. Look at these, Hendricks said. The way the symbols repeat, the way certain information is organized, the way they emphasize certain details. This is not the structure of a formal language. This is the structure of a military emergency broadcast. This is a species in crisis, trying to pass on survival information. The representatives watched as Hendricks walked them through dozens of examples. He showed how the predecessors had organized information about escape routes, how they had documented safe locations, how they had recorded the behavioral patterns of their enemy. Every section of the presentation was designed not to impress with complexity, but to convince with clarity. The predecessors knew they were going to lose, Hendricks said near the end of his presentation. They understood that they could not defeat the Devourer in direct combat. So they did what any intelligent species would do. They adapted, they hid, they studied their enemy, and they left behind everything they learned in the clearest, most direct way possible. He brought up the final section of the predecessor warning. This section, translated completely, says, "We do not know if anyone will find this. We do not know if anyone will understand this. But if you do find it, and if you do understand it, then you must prepare. The Devourer will come. It always comes. It hunts slowly and methodically, but it hunts. Be ready. Survive." The chamber fell silent. Every representative understood the weight of what they had just heard. "Captain Hendricks," the council leader spoke, "what are your recommendations?" Hendricks took a moment before answering. This was not a military strategy discussion. This was something far more significant. This was about the survival of the entire collective. First, he said, we need to establish defensive systems based on the predecessor knowledge. They documented how the Devourer hunts. We can use that information to create detection systems. Second, we need to position warning stations throughout our territory. The predecessors survived by maintaining communication between scattered communities. We need to do the same. Third, we need to prepare our military forces for an enemy unlike anything we have faced before. And finally, the council leader asked. Finally, Hendricks said quietly, we need to remember something important. We are not the first intelligent species to face this threat. The predecessors did not win, but they did survive. They found ways to protect themselves and their people. They documented their knowledge so that others could learn from their experience. We can do the same. We can be better than they were. We have the advantage of knowing what they learned. We have 7 different species working together instead of one. We have technology that the predecessors might never have imagined. But more than anything, we have each other. He looked at each of the representatives in turn. The predecessors were alone when the Devourer came. We are not alone. That gives us an advantage that they did not have. The applause that followed was not loud and dramatic. It was quiet and respectful. The representatives of the collective understood that they had just received a gift far more valuable than any technology or discovery. They had received perspective. They had received wisdom earned through centuries of warfare and survival. As the formal presentation ended and the representatives began to depart, many of them paused to acknowledge Hendricks. Some extended their limbs in greeting. Some made gestures that were specific to their own species, but all meant the same thing. Thank you. Respect. Later that evening, Hendricks stood alone at the observation window of the archive station. The dead planet Predecessor 7 rotated below, its surface glowing faintly in the light of the distant star. Somewhere, down there, beneath the dust and ancient stone, the predecessors still rested. Their civilization had been destroyed, their cities had crumbled, but they had left behind a message. And now, after 3,000 years, that message had finally been heard. Ketvorn approached silently. The crystalline Zoltian stood beside his human friend and looked out at the same view. You know, Hendricks said, when I first got here, I thought this was a waste of time. I thought I was just a soldier wasting his final years before retirement. I did not think I could help with something like this. And now? Ketvorn asked. Now I understand something I learned a long time ago, Hendricks replied. Intelligence is not just about having the biggest brain or the most computing power. Intelligence is about asking the right questions. And sometimes, asking the right question means thinking like someone who has lived through hard things. Someone who understands what desperate people do. Someone who knows that when survival is on the line, you cut away everything fancy and just focus on what matters. That is wisdom, Captain, Ketvorn said. And it is why the collective was wise to bring humanity into our alliance. We have knowledge. We have technology. We have science. But we were missing something fundamental. We were missing the perspective of a species that had learned to survive against great odds. The two friends stood together in silence, watching the planet below. The dead language had finally been read. The ancient warning had finally been heard. And the collective, for the first time in its history, understood that they were part of something much larger than themselves. They were part of a chain of civilizations, stretching back through time, each one learning, each one surviving, each one hoping that their knowledge would matter to those who came after. Because one human soldier had asked a simple question. Because one person had been willing to see things differently. Because someone had understood that the greatest intelligence comes not from the most complex analysis, but from the clearest understanding of what people need to survive. The story of Captain James Hendricks did not end here. His work with the archive station would continue for the rest of his life. He would help the collective prepare for the threat that the predecessors had warned about. He would help train new researchers and strategists. He would share the lessons that humanity had learned through its own long struggle for survival. But perhaps most importantly, he would show the entire collective that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from those with the most impressive credentials, but from those who are willing to ask simple questions and listen to the answers that desperate people leave behind.